Join us now from the Sentinel Studios in Crestview, California, for the greatest cover-up in American history.
Wiesbaden, Germany, July 1945. The war in Europe has been over for 2 months. The ruins of the Third Reich still smolder across a shattered continent. And in a requisitioned office building not far from the Rhine, an American investigator is about to encounter something that will haunt him for the rest of his life.
Briggs, you need to see this.
I'm reviewing the Hadamar file, Leon. Whatever it is, it can wait.
It can't. It's from the War Crimes Branch. Colonel Hargrove sent it over this morning.
I'm listening, Leon. Have a seat and tell me what's so urgent.
Here's the letter. Read it for yourself. I circled the most important paragraph.
Although large numbers of German nationals were killed at this institution, the report of investigation and consequently this memorandum of review is concerned, in the main, only with the killings of the nationals of other nations, which in this case are those of Russia and Poland. This is so because there appears to be no substantial evidence that those Germans who were killed were not, in fact, incurably insane.
15,000 people, Briggs. 15,000.
I can read, Leon.
They were murdered by doctors in the name of science. And we're just going to...
Keep your voice down.
We have the evidence. We have the witnesses. 15,000 Germans were gassed in that facility. Gassed by doctors in the name of science. And we're going to walk away from all of it because of what exactly? Because there's no substantial evidence they weren't insane?
That's what the letter says.
It doesn't make sense. There was no official law authorizing these so-called mercy killings. What Hitler signed was a document on his personal stationery, never published, never formally enacted as legislation. And we're going to walk away from 15,000 murders because there's no substantial evidence they weren't insane?
The decision has been made, Leon.
By who? Who made this decision? The letter is signed by a first lieutenant. A first lieutenant is telling us to walk away from 15,000 murders, and nobody above him...
You want to know what I think?
I'm all ears.
I think there are things happening in this occupation zone that you and I are not meant to understand. I think there are people in Washington, and in our universities, and in our scientific institutions, who are very uncomfortable with where a full prosecution of the Hadamar personnel would lead.
What do you mean?
How much do you know about what's been happening in American science for the last 30 years?
I know the law. I've read the majority opinion in Buck versus Bell. But that's an American Supreme Court ruling, Briggs. It's a far cry from 15,000 Germans murdered in a basement.
Is it? Cold Spring Harbor, Harry Laughlin, Ernest Houghton standing up before the American College of Physicians 4 years ago and calling for forced euthanasia in the pages of the New York Times.
Euthanasia? In the New York Times?
April 1941, while the program at Hadamar was running at full capacity. You see the problem.
If we put the science on trial at Hadamar...
We put American science on trial. And nobody wants that. Come in.
Captain Briggs, Margaret Holloway, Associated Press. I've been credentialed to cover the Hadamar trial. I was told you could brief me on the charges.
Miss Holloway, the trial concerns the murders of Soviet and Polish nationals at the Hadamar facility. 7 defendants. We expect to begin October 8th.
And the German patients? I've heard reports of thousands of mentally ill Germans killed at the Hadamar facility.
The prosecution will focus on the murder of foreign nationals.
Why?
That is the scope of the charges, Miss Holloway.
I see. And who made that decision?
That will be all for today, Miss Holloway.
Thank you for the briefing, Captain. You've been most clarifying.
She's going to keep asking that question.
If she's worth her salt, she won't stop until she gets some real answers.
In the summer of 1945, a single dispatch arrived in Wiesbaden that would hammer the shape of the historical record for years to come. The men who received it were soldiers. They knew the weight of a command, and they followed their orders to the letter. They buried the truth in the deep silence of the official files, leaving a story that would remain untold, gathering dust in the dark.
And now, Scene 2, the trial.
Wiesbaden, Germany, October 8th, 1945. The trial of United States versus Alphonse Klein et al. Begins before an American military tribunal. Lord Wright, chairman of the United Nations War Crimes Commission, is in attendance. Representatives from most Allied nations are present. It is the first mass atrocity trial held on German soil. And it is not what it appears to be.
The gallery is full. Lord Wright is in the front row. Russian delegation behind him. Keep your eyes on Warman. Watch his reaction when the charges are read.
The charge before this tribunal concerns the willful, deliberate, and wrongful killing of Polish and Russian nationals at the Hadamar facility between July 1944 and April 1945. The number of victims aggregating in excess of 400. How do the defendants plead?
400. We're here for 400. And 15,000 are not mentioned.
Focus, Leon.
The trial proceeded with devastating efficiency. The evidence was overwhelming. The defendants had admitted the murders. Their only defense was that they had acted under orders, and that defense collapsed almost immediately under cross-examination. What was never mentioned, what never entered the official record, was the gas chamber, the chamber that had taken 15,000 lives. The science that had justified every one of those deaths went free.
Captain Briggs,
Miss Holloway?
I've been in that courtroom for 3 days. The charge sheet says 476 victims. 476. I've done the arithmetic, Captain. The facility operated for 4 years. The witnesses talk about transports arriving daily, 70 at a time. And the official charge is 476.
The charges concern the foreign nationals.
I know what the charges concern. There was a gas chamber in that building. In 1941, it operated for 8 months. And when they shut it down, the killing continued by other means for 4 more years. 15,000 people that the Nazi regime labeled as unfit. And this trial is proceeding as if none of it ever happened.
Miss Holloway, I would strongly suggest you focus your reporting on the trial as it is being conducted.
And I would suggest that the story of why 15,000 murders are not being prosecuted is considerably more important than the story of the 476 that are.
You may be right about that.
Then help me understand it.
What do you know about American eugenics, Miss Holloway?
I know that forced sterilization has been upheld by our Supreme Court. I know Cold Spring Harbor has been operating for decades. I know that Harry Laughlin received an honorary degree from a Nazi university 9 years ago.
Then you already know more than most.
What I don't know is what any of that has to do with this trial.
It has everything to do with this trial. That gas chamber didn't come from nowhere, Miss Holloway. The science behind it didn't originate in Germany. It was developed, refined, and celebrated in American universities, American courtrooms, American scientific journals.
You're saying we can't prosecute them for the science?
Because it's our science. Or it was. Until it became inconvenient.
Captain, they need you back inside.
We never had this conversation, Miss Holloway.
Yes, we did.
On October 15th, 1945, all 7 defendants were convicted. 6 were sentenced to death. 1 received a life sentence. The American press reported it as a landmark victory for post-war justice. No American newspaper mentioned the gas chamber. No American newspaper asked why 15,000 murders had never entered the official record. The story that needed to be told would wait for a very long time.
Join us now for Scene 3, The Warning.
Washington, D.C., October 1946. The Hadamar Trial is a year in the past. The Nuremberg Tribunal is winding down. Margaret Holloway has spent 12 months pulling threads, and every thread has led her back to the same man.
Captain Briggs, thank you for seeing me.
I'm a civilian in 3 weeks, Miss Holloway. You caught me just in time. How did you find me?
I'm a reporter. Finding people is what I do.
You haven't printed anything?
No.
Why not?
I went to my editor, told him what I had. He listened. And when I finished, he told me he would never print part of a story. And then he told me that if I knew what was best for me, I would never speak to him about this again.
He knew about it already?
He knew enough. And whatever he knew, it was enough to scare him. He told me that bad things seemed to follow people who examined this story too closely.
He wasn't wrong.
And yet here I am, because I am not willing to let it go.
No, I didn't think you would be. I've been carrying this for a year. I wasn't sure what to do with it. Maybe talking to you is the right thing. Maybe it isn't. But I'm leaving this building in 3 weeks, and I don't want to take it with me.
What is it?
You remember the letter? The one that told us to stand down on the 15,000.
The Mapes letter, yes.
Read the key passage.
This is so because there appears to be no substantial evidence that those Germans who were killed were not, in fact, incurably insane. They accepted Hitler's word. The prosecution accepted a document signed on Hitler's personal stationery as a valid legal defense for 15,000 murders.
Never formally enacted as law, never published, never subject to any legislative process. And we took his word for it that the people he gassed were incurably insane.
We accepted the Nazi euthanasia program on its own terms.
Something about the way that trial ended never sat right with me. The convictions, the headlines, everyone calling it justice. I knew what we hadn't said in that courtroom. When I got back to Washington, I gave a series of debriefings to the brass about the Hadamar trial. Colonel Raymond Hayes sat in on one of those sessions. When it was over, he pulled me aside, asked if we could talk, off the books.
You knew him?
I had served under him early in the war, lost track of him when he was assigned to the OSS in early 1944. When the OSS was disbanded last October, he came back to Washington, got stationed here at the Pentagon. He knew I had first-hand knowledge of what had really happened at Hadamar, and more importantly, what hadn't.
When was this?
March. We met off the books. I brought the mate's letter, showed him the key passage. He read it twice. Didn't say anything for a long time.
What did he say when he finally spoke?
He told me the letter was only part of the story, that the real story went back further than Hadamar, further than the war. And then he told me about William Jennings Bryan. He said the nation was sitting on a powder keg.
What do you mean?
Everyone remembers the Scopes trial, but Hayes pointed me to what Bryan had actually been trying to warn this country about. And when I heard it, I understood why powerful people wanted it buried.
What was he warning about?
He was warning that the same ideology that justified German atrocities in Belgium during the First World War, the idea that nature rewards the strong and eliminates the weak, was being taught in American universities. And Bryan believed it would produce something far worse than Belgium.
He was right.
He went to that trial to argue it before the world. Darrow denied him the platform. Bryan died 5 days after the trial ended. His warning was never delivered. And then came the Holocaust.
Hayes said this nation is sitting on a powder keg. What did he mean by that?
Hayes believed that if the American public ever learned the truth about the role science played in the Holocaust, it would be over for the secularists. 30 years of driving Christianity out of American institutions, gone. Traditional Christianity back in. The secular establishment out on their ears. That is why this story could never see the light of day.
I want to print this.
I know you do.
Will you go on record?
Not yet. But keep pulling the threads, Miss Holloway. The story is there. It has always been there. It just needs someone willing to follow it all the way to the end.
Captain Briggs, the Mapes letter. Can I keep this copy?
That's why I brought it.
Margaret Holloway walked out of the Pentagon that October afternoon, carrying a copy of a letter that would shape her understanding of post-war America for the rest of her life. The story she was building was unlike anything she had ever covered. It was not the story of what happened at Hadamar. It was the story of what was never allowed to be known about Hadamar. And the people who had made sure of that were still very much in power.
And now, Scene 4, The Informant.
Los Angeles, California, December 31st, 1949. Margaret Holloway has spent 3 years following this story. Tonight, she sits across from the man who may be able to tell her everything.
Miss Holloway, I have been waiting a long time for someone to ask these questions.
Professor Forsyth, thank you for agreeing to meet with me.
Colonel Hayes told me about you. He said you were persistent.
People keep telling me that.
In this case, it is a compliment. Where would you like to begin?
Hartwell College, 1937. Modern Propaganda. Controlling Information in an Age of Mass Media. You published that book 12 years ago. What were you trying to say?
I was trying to document how modern institutions, governments, universities, media organizations could shape what a population believed to be true, how information could be managed, controlled, how entire chapters of history could be written or left unwritten, depending on who controlled the narrative.
And then in early 1942, you were drafted.
I was never going to fire a rifle, Miss Holloway. They had other plans for me.
What do you mean, other plans?
A government operation run out of a federal building in Washington, D.C. Nondescript, no sign on the door, no official name that anyone used openly. They had read my book.
What did they ask you to do?
They asked me to apply everything I had written about, to develop methods, systematic methods, for managing how the American public would understand the relationship between science and what was happening in Germany.
How many methods?
5, each one carefully designed, each one serving a specific purpose.
Start from the beginning.
The first was the simplest, academic silence. You simply ensure that the questions that need to go unasked go unasked. You shape what gets published, what gets funded, what gets taught. If no respected scholar examines the connection between science and what happened in Germany, the connection simply does not exist in the public mind.
But surely some scholars would ask the question independently.
Some did, and those scholars found that their work did not get published. Their funding dried up. Their careers stalled. You do not need to silence everyone, Miss Holloway. You only need to make sure that the right people understand the boundaries.
What was the second method?
We called it the social Darwinism firewall. Academic silence prevents the question from being asked, but you also need something more active, something that shapes how people think about the relationship between science and what Germany did.
I don't follow.
The danger was that the American public would connect Darwin to what happened in Germany, that they would see the Holocaust not as the product of Nazism, but as the product of a scientific worldview that had deep roots in American universities. We needed to prevent that connection from being made.
How do you prevent something like that?
You find respected historians and you resurrect the concept of social Darwinism. You give it a specific meaning. You make it the villain, the scapegoat for everything science had done. Social Darwinism killed those people, not Darwin, not mainstream science, not the universities. Social Darwinism, a discredited fringe movement that real scientists had nothing to do with.
But social Darwinism came directly from Darwin.
Where did social Darwinism come from? We invented it. Or perhaps more accurately, we revived it so it could take the blame. That is how you shape a narrative, Miss Holloway. You do not suppress the truth. You redirect it. And once the redirection is in place, the truth becomes almost impossible to find.
The third method?
The careful structuring of the war crimes trials. This was the most delicate. The trials had to happen. The world demanded justice. But the scope of what was prosecuted, what was examined, what entered the official record, that required very careful management.
The Mapes letter?
Where did you get that?
Does it matter?
No, I suppose it doesn't. That letter represented a decision that was made very early, before the trials began. The science behind those 15,000 murders could not be examined in a courtroom, not when the same science had been celebrated in American universities just years before.
So the prosecution accepted Hitler's word that the victims were incurably insane.
A document on his personal stationery, never enacted as law, never published. And yes, the prosecution accepted it as a potentially valid framework, because the alternative was unthinkable.
Why?
Because prosecuting that science in a German courtroom meant putting American science on trial, and the people who had built their careers on that science were not going to allow that.
The fourth method?
Marginalizing the memory of the Nazi euthanasia program. The gas chamber at Hadamar, the 15,000. That story could not be allowed to become part of the public understanding of the Holocaust. Because the moment it did, people would ask about the science behind it. They would ask about the eugenics ideology. They would ask about American complicity.
So it was buried?
Historians were encouraged to treat the euthanasia program as separate from the broader Holocaust. A footnote, an anomaly, something that did not need to be examined too closely.
So it just disappears?
Stories don't disappear, Miss Holloway. They get buried. And buried things stay buried as long as nobody starts digging.
So not everyone will be happy that I have started digging?
No, they will not.
And the fifth method?
The Nazi propaganda films. After the war, the Allies banned more than 300 Nazi propaganda films. Among the most significant were the films produced to promote the forced euthanasia program. Films that explicitly used the language of Darwinian evolution to justify the murder of disabled people.
Those films still exist?
They exist, under lock and key. And the people who control access to them have every reason to make sure they stay that way. A film is a powerful thing, Miss Holloway. The moment those films reach a general audience, every question that has been carefully managed for years gets asked all at once.
Professor Forsyth, you helped build the cover-up. Why are you telling me all of this?
In October of this year, my wife dragged me to a tent meeting in Los Angeles. A young evangelist named Billy Graham. I went because she asked me to. I stayed because something happened that I cannot fully explain. I walked out of that tent a different man, Miss Holloway.
Your faith?
My faith. And with it, a clarity about what I had spent the better part of a decade doing. I called Colonel Hayes the next morning, told him what had happened. He laughed, told me he had been a Christian for years. I had no idea.
What did Hayes say when you told him you wanted to talk?
He said that he had just the person I needed to talk to. He said, your name, Miss Holloway.
I intend to print this.
I know. That is why we are talking. But, Miss Holloway, I want you to understand something before you leave this room. These are not bureaucrats protecting their careers. These are people who believe what they are doing is necessary. And people like that do not stop.
Professor Forsyth, you agree that everything you have told me tonight is on the record?
It is on the record, Miss Holloway. Every word. God willing, the truth will find its way out.
Margaret Holloway left Professor Leonard Forsyth's apartment in Los Angeles in the early hours of January 1st, 1950. She had the story, every piece of it, documented on the record. She began the long drive back to her hotel. She never arrived.
And now the conclusion of our story.
Margaret Holloway never arrived, because unfortunately, she never existed. There was no reporter willing to do the arithmetic, no reporter who looked at a charge sheet listing 476 victims and asked the obvious question about the 15,000 who were not mentioned. No reporter willing to follow the story wherever it led, regardless of what her editor said, regardless of what it might cost her. There was also no one like Captain Briggs. No one on the inside of the prosecution team who understood what had been left out of that courtroom in Wiesbaden. No one willing to make sure that America learned the truth of the Mapes to Mize letter. And there was no one like Professor Leonard Forsyth. No one who had helped shape the post-war narrative and then, convicted by his conscience and his newfound faith, was willing to go on the record and tell the truth. These people never existed. And that is precisely the point. For decades, no one asked the question. No one followed the evidence. No one read the letter carefully enough to notice that what it actually said was different from how it had been described in the historical literature. Until a retired public school teacher from Sherman, Texas, guided by a faith he makes no apology for, began pulling the threads. Discovery after discovery. Each one found not in secret files or classified documents, but in the published academic writings of credentialed mainstream scholars. Scholars who had no intention of supporting his argument, who did not know they were building his case, who revealed the truth piece by piece in footnotes and essays and academic journals that most Americans will never read. And then came the most significant discovery of all, the Mapes to Mize letter, a document sitting in the National Archives for 80 years. A credentialed Holocaust historian cited it as her source for explaining why Allied prosecutors did not prosecute those 15,000 murders. Her explanation was a legal one, that prosecutors simply lacked the authority under international law to try Germans for crimes against other Germans. But that is not what the letter says. The letter gives a completely different reason. It says there was no substantial evidence that the Germans who were killed were not, in fact, incurably insane. In other words, the prosecution accepted the Nazi euthanasia program on its own terms. If the victims were insane, the killings were potentially defensible. So the prosecution walked away. Think about what that means. The first major Allied war crimes trial on German soil effectively validated the premise that human beings deemed mentally unfit could be killed by their government. That is not a legal technicality. That is a decision. And the explanation that has appeared in the historical record for decades, the explanation citing legal jurisdiction, is not supported by the document cited as its basis. It is not a minor scholarly error. And that false explanation has protected the reputation of science from the most important question it has ever faced. That question is simple. If 4 states restricted the teaching of evolution because of the role Darwinism played in the deaths of 6,000 Belgian civilians in World War I, why did the Holocaust, explicitly justified by its perpetrators as applied biology, produce no equivalent reckoning against science in America? That question has never been answered. Before we conclude, there is one more point that must be made. If a certain phrase in this drama made you uncomfortable, good. It should have. Throughout this story, from the courtroom in Wiesbaden to the Pentagon to a Los Angeles apartment on New Year's Eve, a phrase was repeated. We took Hitler's word that the people he gassed were incurably insane. Stop and consider what that statement actually implies. It implies that if those 15,000 people were in fact incurably insane, it was acceptable to kill them. Even the most honorable people in this story, people of conscience, people of faith, gave tacit approval to that premise. And perhaps that is the most sobering lesson of all. Good and decent people of genuine faith can be shaped by the culture around them in ways they may never fully recognize. The culture they lived in had spent decades quietly teaching that human value could be measured by utility. And even the best among them were not entirely immune to that idea. And that is precisely what makes it so dangerous. A worldview that assigns human value based on utility, based on health, based on what a person can contribute to society. That is not a Christian worldview. A Christ-centered worldview declares that every human being, regardless of mental capacity, regardless of physical condition, regardless of what they can or cannot contribute, is made in the image of God, sacred, valuable, worthy of protection. Even if there is such a thing as incurable mental illness today, in an age when artificial intelligence may soon cure diseases that have plagued humanity for centuries, those who carry that burden are not less valuable in the eyes of God. They are not burdens to be eliminated. They are image bearers of the living God. The worldview that produced Hadamar said otherwise. And the worldview that is quietly reasserting itself in American institutions today, the same secular materialist worldview that produced Cold Spring Harbor and Buck versus Bell and Ernest Houghton standing before the American College of Physicians, is moving in the same direction. That is why this story matters. That is why the question must be asked and answered. That is why human life is sacred, not because science says so, but because God says so. The full story, 30 years of research documented in the pages of the greatest cover-up in American history, is available free at greatestcoverup.info. Read the report, watch the videos, share it with everyone you know. The reporters and the insiders and the witnesses that this story needed, they never came. But the truth came anyway, because that is what truth does.
Thanks for listening to the greatest cover-up in American history.